Hat on indoors. Why? Because. So, I recently had an Uber trip, and y'all know, I constantly talk to Uber drivers. I have in depth conversations that last the length of the trip. And I was speaking with one guy who was actually from Somalia, and my Midwestern town actually has a very strong Somalian population, along with, and interestingly enough, he explained to me that, anyway, yes. And he's from Somalia, still has a bit of an accent, and that's why I ask. And he's been in this area for 35 years, right? He said he came in his 20s when Reagan was president. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I was like 5. But he is very much, very proudly a Republican, very proudly a Trumper. And the conversation was interesting because I know not all Republicans are fans of President Trump, but he was and is a fan of President Trump. And we got into the discussion. I told him about my sexuality, and it didn't seem to matter. I tried to mention it a lot deliberately to make it like a part of commonplace conversation. Like it's not like, oh, like it's not something that you're making. You're not turning tables over trying to bring it up. It's just, it is what it is. Love is love, right? And he's a big Trump fan, and I said all of that to him, and he's like, well, and he was cool. He was, and this is something interesting. Sometimes people might seem really cool with me bringing that up, and on the inside, they're like, boy. Anyway, he we had a really good conversation, and he explained that he's like, yes, part of what I love about President Trump is that he is anti, and he started wording it the way he was wording it. I'm like, okay, so he's not talking about me, he's talking about something else. And he's like, no, the reason, part of what love about President Trump is that he does not like your LGBT whatever community. He's not a fan of that. He believes that God says there's one man and one woman, and that's the way it's supposed to be. The core of our conversation was not about that. It could have been, but we actually discussed he asked me a lot of questions, and I enjoy such conversations with people who are perhaps on the other side of the proverbial aisle, because as long as it's not like, because I can tell when people get tense about something, or when people feel like, well, why do you think? It's like, well, don't you know that? It's like, oh, okay, pump your brakes. But it was a very good conversation. Like, we were on different ends of it. And he's like, yes, I am proudly a Trump supporter. I think he is a wonderful man. And why? He also shaded my fellow Howard University Bison when he was like, I am glad she didn't win. And I'm like, really? Stop. Now, I will say this, and this is what I spoke, connected with him on him explaining he's from Somalia, 35 years living here, but from Somalia. And I explained, oh, interesting, because I actually, this is really tough. I don't want to say I'm divided because of it. I think it's an alternate way to think, is what I'll say. And I explained that one thing I found interesting is when I went and met in person after quite some time. We met in person in Nairobi, Kenya, and this past July, and he's my love. I love him. Period. 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 Anyway, yes. And it is what it is. Forever. Okay? And I was explaining to the Uber driver one thing that I found interesting about my time in Kenya the week. I was, this was before the election. Again, it was July. And I would ask people just casually because I know the world pays attention to America. The world does. Okay? And I asked, I was like, okay, so who are you interested in voting it for? If you were an American citizen, who would you vote for in this upcoming election? And a lot of people were like, prefer Trump. They would be like, yeah, we prefer Trump. And I'm like, that's so interesting. Really? Like well, that's, and I would proudly say this, and this is what it is, what it was and what it is. I was like, I'm voting to be the president.
This is a reminder. Iconic glasses to you. PS. Just let me know if this is
My auto reminder. I'm sorry. I decide about yelling over it, but sometimes I don't. Anyway. Yes. 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 Echo, this is done. Thank you. And it says that so quietly. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But I would always let them know proudly I am voting for my fellow Howard University Bison, Kamala Harris, in this election, period. Period, point blank, voting blue all the way down. Because I actually see the importance of that now, more so than before. Because I used to kind of I I would be a little less red and blue or black and white, red and blue as people could say. But I would have room for nuance with people. Be like, well, he might be a Republican, but I agree with that. And I kind of see, I'm learning what people say as far as the benefit of just voting down the ticket blue, period. And anyway, as far as the Uber driver, and when I was in Kenya, and people would proudly say, we are in favor of Trump. And this is what I found interesting. When I would ask people, I'd be like, why that? They would say, because when Trump was president, he left us alone. When Democrats are in office, they mess with what we have. And it's like Trump was just like, F it, leave them alone. And they're like, that's what we want. We just want to be left alone. So that can be tough because it's like, oh, I get that. Already at 9? Okay, sorry. But, yes. So I said that to the Uber driver, and he was like, yeah, good, because he's from a neighboring country to Kenya. Didn't speak Somali. Didn't speak, well, I already told you all he's from Somalia, but didn't speak Kiswahili, but he's from Somalia, which is also in East Africa. Anyway, he He's just a Republican. And he asked me, he's like, so why are you Democrat? And I was like, I'm Democrat because dot, dot, dot. And I believe the children are the future. Teach them, anyway, let me stop. Teach them well and let them lead the way. It was an interesting conversation. Like I said, I appreciate conversations like that. I am still proudly Democrat. I am still proud of the fact that I voted for former, proud Republican Dave Ramsey when we were electing Trump, and he's a Trumper. He was like, I think it's so, because he can be very outspoken. He's like, I think it's ridiculous when people call presidents the former President Trump, stuff like that. He's like, no, the way that it works, whenever you hold the office, you will be known as president forever, period. And I guess that makes sense, because that's right. We it's not like we do that with like George Washington, former President George Washington. No. Former President Abraham Lincoln. No. So I get that. So, Vice President Kamala Harris. I would still proudly vote for her today. Period. Anyway, we had a good conversation, though. He was a very nice guy and helped me in my wheelchair, which is my current situation, not always. I'm going to get out of this thing. In fact, I'm going to do a little exercise right now, out of it. Talk to y'all later, YouTube. Peace, stay blessed, and love. All right.